Welcome to the 42 to Doomsday podcast. In this latest episode, Mark and I host special guest Richard Molesworth to chat about his latest book. While writing prolifically about the history of Doctor Who, Richard has also been a member of the Doctor Who restoration team, contributing to the VHS, DVD, and now Blu Ray ranges. Richard's extensive research into the history of the show has borne fruit in the form of Wiped, Doctor Who's missing episodes, Robert Holmes' A Life in Words, and now his latest, soon-to-be-released book, The John Nathan Turner Doctor Who Production Diary, 1979 to 1990, coming soon from Telos Publishing. Richard, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, Mark. Hello, Rob.
Richard, again, welcome to the podcast. And Mark and I have had a chance to look over your book, and it's a very extensive, very in-depth look into the production process during John Nathan Turner's reign. Your introduction mentions that during lockdown, that particular period of your life helped stimulate you to write the book. What was that like, living in lockdown and coming up with, or, deciding to write the book? I mean, how did you go about it, given the circumstances at that time?
I mean, it was all rather depressing. I don't know how badly Australia was affected by COVID. I think you kept quite out of it for quite a long time, from what I understand. But here in the UK, it went from bad to worse very quickly in February and March 2020. And it became very apparent in middle of March. I mean, even before there was an official lockdown, that a lockdown was going to be looming. And at the time, there was just no idea of how long it would continue. COVID was still very new. There wasn't a vaccine. There was no end game. We were looking at potentially all sorts of possibilities. We were forbade from socializing or seeing friends and family. And I thought, I'm going to go very, very mad very, very quickly if I don't do something to occupy my time and try and keep myself sane. As you mentioned, I've written a couple of books previously, know full well what it entails to write a book. And it's not something I did lightly, because it's a lot of work and it's soul destroying at times when you're trying to get things together. I don't want to paint the picture of an overwrought artist here, but it's a lot of work to put a book together. But I thought, I could be like this in this situation for months, possibly years even. So let's use the time profitably if at all possible. It was something I'd been toying with as a project for quite some time. I'd thought to myself, we've got a lot of John's paperwork, which it was all in bits. I thought, if somebody can sit down and assemble all this together and make a coherent chronological history of what was going on when, it would offer a very interesting insight, I thought, into how Doctor Who was made when John was producer, and maybe give some insights as to why John made a few of the decisions he did and what was going on in the production office in the 80s. A lot of stories have come out, and there's a lot of controversy about John's time, which we'll probably touch on later. But for some reason, I just thought that would be a good project to get my teeth into. So I went for it. A lot of the paperwork that John left after he passed away, and Gary passed away, went to a good friend of mine and Paul Venice's and people on the restoration team, a lovely chap called Stephen Cramford. And he'd very kindly lent all the paperwork to us to use as we saw fit on the Blu-ray and DVD ranges before the Blu-rays. So it was just a question of going through forensically everything in the folders and files.
And how did you sort that information out? I mean, you've got obviously a 10-year reign there of John's time on the program. Did you basically get each piece of paper and have a section in your house where it's like one quarter of the room's 1979 to 80 and sort of progress it that way? Or how did you sort of sift through it all and work out that chronology?
It was a bit more 21st century than that. I'd scanned a lot of the documents into PDF files, over the years, and most of them were there sitting on the laptop or on the computer. And it was just a question of going through them and extracting all the information and putting it into a chronological list, if you like, a diary. What really made me sit down and think this would be a good project in the first place was going through something I thought would be very, very uninteresting, and that was John's expense claims.
Yes.
He got loads and loads of just very boring BBC expense claim forms. But then I started to notice he was logging who he was seeing and not why he was seeing them, but what he was doing. So, I thought, oh, right, he went to see Elizabeth Sladen on this date, and he took a taxi to see Peter Davison on this date. And all of a sudden you can see what he was doing and when, simply by tracking who he was having meetings with and paying for lunches for.
Was he a gregarious person by nature, or was it the nature of the job that, required him to be out and about as much as he was? Because looking at the information that you've put together, he's in and out of the office seemingly on a constant basis over those, 10 years.
Did either of you ever meet John?
No.
I know he only visited Australia the once while he was producer in 84, I think.
Yes, that's right. No, he went to Sydney, we were in Melbourne.
I met him a number of times, mainly after he'd left the BBC. And gregarious was exactly what John was like. He was a person who liked to just sit down and have a natter with people, have a few drinks, exchange tawdry bits of showbiz gossip, tell some really bad jokes, and just have a good time. He was a very, very gregarious chap. Now, I can't speak for what he was like in his professional life and how that might have translated, but it wouldn't surprise me if he was more or less the same.
So just to give the listeners some context for the times, at the time John was appointed producer, what was the state of the show in 1979?
It depends on what your point of view is. I thought it was very healthy as a viewer. I joined the Doctor Who Appreciation Society in 1982, and reading the comments in the TARDIS fanzines and various other publications, I was quite shocked to see how much scorn and derision organised fandom were aiming at the show under Graham Williams and Tom Baker's years under him, all of which I was pretty blind to as a non-fan. From the BBC's perspective, I think they didn't have a problem at all with Doctor Who. It was very, very healthy in the ratings. They particularly liked Tom Baker. He was good for the BBC. He was good for Doctor Who. So I think they were more than happy with Doctor Who the way it was under Graham Williams. And, I certainly thought the programme was it wasn't as good as it had been. Everybody says that about Doctor Who, or it used to be better back when, blah, blah, blah. But I didn't think there were any causes for concern. And obviously, John was brought in because Graham had just had enough of trying to get the show made on time and to budget. He'd been doing it for 3 years, and I think he'd found it increasingly more frustrating, especially in the situation we had in the UK in the late 70s when inflation was spiralling excessively. The BBC used to fix the budgets at the start of the financial year. So from 1st of April through to 30th of March, that's your financial year, that's your production year, I think. And you're given your budget on day one for that 12 months. And when 6 months down the line, that budget has reduced in real terms by 10%. And by the end of the 12 months, it could be as little as down as much as 15 or 20%. You really are fighting a losing battle.
And when JNT was selected as producer, did Graham McDonald have any other contenders in mind, or was JNT the man for the job at that time?
I don't actually know the answer to that question, in all honesty. I've heard different accounts from different people. It does strike me as odd, though, that Verity Lambert had never produced before she became producer of Doctor Who, and oddly, I don't think Barry Letts had. He'd been directing, but I don't think he'd done much in the way of producing. And I think Graham Williams was more of a script editor than he was a producer. And that's where Philip Hinchcliffe's early years were, in the script departments. So John had definitely come through a different route or a different thought process. He'd had no real formal training in scripting and how scripts worked. And that seemed to be the backbone of how, the previous couple of producers had been appointed. And Barry Letts was a very competent and well-regarded director and had been an actor. So I don't think there's ever this is what we need for a producer, especially a Doctor Who producer. But John did break the mold a little bit. He was an unusual choice, I think, whether that was because there were no other ideal candidates or because Graham McDonald did think that John would thrive if he was given the opportunity. I wouldn't like to offer an opinion.
The appointment of Barry Letts as I believe the term was executive producer. Does that indicate that Graham McDonald had doubts about JNT, or was it simply that JNT may not have had, the right, quote unquote, experience and needed just a bit of a guiding hand during his first year?
I think the truth might lie somewhere in the middle. I think Graham McDonald thought that somebody needed to be a bit more hands-on with Doctor Who than he could as the head of department. Now, the head of department nominally was always the executive producer of Doctor Who, even if they weren't credited on screen. And I think Graham McDonald felt that he was able to work with Graham Williams and keep a very light touch in that respect. Perhaps he suspected that John might need a little bit more time and attention, certainly in the first few months of his producership, than he could devote himself. And as he didn't know much about Doctor Who, by his own admission, and he had Barry Letts working in his department as a producer on the classic series at the time, he thought that would be the solution to the problem. I don't necessarily think that he was concerned about John's lack of experience, although that might well have been a factor. And I think ultimately Graham had the right instinct in doing that with Barry Letts, because John certainly, to begin with, did make a few schoolboy errors and did have problems in the early days of actually getting a production into the studio and out again in the allocated time, which was always the bottom line with the BBC. Back in those days, you had your studio blocks and you had to finish recording at 10 o'clock, no questions, on every studio day, whether you had 2 days or 3 days in the studio block. Not the most creative of environments to have to work in, but the statutes that the BBC laid down to every production, be it Doctor Who or Bergerac or Howard's Way or Last of the Summer Wine or whatever else they were making at the time. Everyone had to play by the same rules, and John did have problems to begin with. The Leisure Hive was a car crash of a production, really.
I did start to wince at the constant, at least at the beginning of his tenure, the requirement for him, JNT, to have to explain to Graham McDonald and then later David Reed about why he was 5 minutes over or 7 minutes over or 15 minutes over. It is an interesting way that the BBC made television back in the day, and I suppose the people involved in television then would love to grab with both hands the way TV is made today, I suppose.
Yeah, the flexibility that modern TV and the current Doctor Who production team have to make the show and to work the hours they want to be able to get the best out of the actors and the crew and the cast and the locations and everything. It's a luxury that any of the classic series producers never had. Maybe it's a shame. Just going back to your comment about all the memos that John sent. I mean, I think it was just a BBC policy. If you overrun, you had to be accountable, and your line manager, your head of department, would want, in writing, a little note to say why you'd overrun on a particular day.
Do you know if John sort of felt any sort of slight that Barry Letts was sort of appointed to oversee his first year of production? Do you know, or was he actually sort of happy to have a bit of a guiding hand?
I think he found Barry to be a good sounding board, although I do think maybe John did resent having Barry put in charge of him, if you like. That wasn't standard BBC policy, and I don't know that I can think off the top of my head of any other programmes that it happened with or new producers. So I think his nose could have been put out of joint a little bit. He certainly made use of Barry, and Barry was very, very helpful towards John, certainly in terms of sitting down and reading the scripts that John and his script editors had commissioned and offering very good sound advice on them. But I didn't really go too much into detail in the book about what Barry was doing, because it's not a book about Barry, it's a book about John.
Exactly. Barry Letts took over the production of the series in 1969-70. He brought many innovations to the production schedule and the way they did things, especially around CSO and the way they sort of scheduled things, having 2-week cycles and things like that. Did JNT sort of bring any innovations or anything new to the way he produced the program, which sort of made him sort of stand apart from some of his peers and his predecessors, or did he sort of just follow the usual production regime that the BBC used to churn out programs?
I think John tinkered around the edges. There was the obvious things. He changed the title sequence, he changed the theme music. In terms of the actual productions, I think under Graham Williams, they'd started having what they used to call gallery only days, which was a cheap way of doing video effects like Canine's blaster and explosions and rays and things like that, which were cost effective. They were still booking the studio, but only the gallery part. They'd got all the videos that they'd recorded and they overlaid all the effects onto them. They were still doing essentially an episode a day sometimes. It was broken up a little bit and taken out of order, but a lot of John's productions, you can see they're starting to really break down the order that they record scenes to make optimum use of sets, and have different set constructions on different studio blocks, so that they could, get everything in the console room done in one day, and everything in, say, the tachyon generator set in the leisure hive on another day, and try and break up the story into blocks that they could, film economically. But they were still looking at, for a 4-part story, 5 studio days and a couple of days location filming. If you didn't have location filming, you might get a 6th studio day, and it was 2 weeks rehearsal, 2 or 3 days in the studio, 2 more weeks rehearsal, 2 or 3 days in the studio. And it was like that from his first story in 79 to his last in 1989. And
that mode of production, that was typical for the BBC and the ITV networks, is that right?
I'm not too sure about ITV. I mean, they had obviously different studios, different practices, different unions, different working hours. But the BBC, yes, if it was made at TV Central or even at Pebble Mill, like Horror of Fang Rock was, that wasn't one of John's productions. But yeah, it was always the same sort of setup. I mean, Blake 7, for instance, they had more production blocks really than story blocks. So they used to, do a lot of filming in one batch, then a lot of studio in one batch. It wasn't, they mixed and matched the stories around, whereas Doctor Who, a story was in production and then another story was in a production and then another story was in production. So series like Blake 7 and presumably things like Z-Cars and Softly Softly, they would have a bit more flexibility in their studio blocks.
Reading through your book, the production process on Doctor Who does seem very linear in terms of the appointment of directors for a set period of time and working consecutively. There was no effort to make things a bit more, I suppose with a limited cast it would be difficult, but there was no effort to make things a little bit more concurrent, or were they doing that anyway?
Television was linear, full stop. I mean, there was no, all the editing was linear. I sat in an edit suite with a 2-inch tape, and you had 2 or 3 2-inch tapes. That was you got to the bit you wanted to record onto your master, you played that bit out, then you got to the next bit. There was no going back and inserting stuff. You had to do it from scene 1 to scene 400 and put each scene in order. And that's how production was as well. So, effectively a director would come in, the scripts had already been commissioned. The first thing they'd do is sit down, read the scripts, go through the script editor, then get the heads of department in, the costume, the makeup, the visual effects, the design department, work out what sets and what costumes and how many casts they could afford and how many extras and would they need any pre-filming. And that had to be done for each and every story. If there was, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3 stories a year, it all had to follow that linear production process, and they all overlapped a little bit. So whilst one director was, in pre-production, another story could be in rehearsals, and another story was due to go into the studio in a few months' time, and another story could be editing. And it all overlapped over a 52-week period of production. So
was, in that regard then, was John Nathan Turner a good manager of the production process? I mean, obviously early on there were, problems, as you mentioned, with the Leisure Hive, but in terms of once he was in harness and sort of trotting along, was John a good manager of people around him and getting things done relatively on time?
I think John, the one thing you can say about John, he knew how the BBC system worked, and he knew how to, wriggle around the shortcuts to the best of the programme's advantage. And he knew who to phone and when to phone and how to get things done. And I think once he got over his initial problems with the Leisure Hive in the first few productions of season 18, which was a learning curve, was to be expected, I suppose. He got into a routine where he could manage things quite effectively. And I think that was his strength. As a producer, getting things done, he was great. I don't think he had much of an insight into how stories work and what makes a good story and what makes a poor story. And I think his way of choosing directors was more to do with, can they finish on time and on budget, rather than can they make a good piece of television? So he certainly had his strengths, and I think his ability to produce with a small p a television program was good. Creatively, I think he had problems, but from a production point of view, it was pretty sound, I would say. However, he was very volatile as well, as you probably gathered from certain parts of the book. If he had a problem with somebody, he had a problem with them, and that problem could have repercussions that would affect the program. And I can't really think of too many examples prior to John becoming producer of that happening in Doctor Who's history. It did happen. They were kept very much in the background.
Was John's volatility sometimes a product of the man himself, or was it more to do with the pressures of the job, or was it really a combination of both? Because we saw in the book, and a number of times where John would blow up and it would cost him a working relationship with someone who would have, had they stayed on, been to the benefit of the series.
I think John could be volatile, and I do think his refusal to, I wouldn't say back down, but to sit back, breathe in and out 10 times and have a good think about what was going on. Perhaps if he'd done that a bit more often, he wouldn't have exploded as often as he did. He wouldn't have had so many confrontations, and he could have prevented situations that he could have possibly have walked away from. And I think it was more about saving face or appearing weak. John, once he'd backed himself into a corner, couldn't really find a way to get out of it without having that explosion and you're on my hit list for life and you'll never work on this program again. And once he'd gone down that route, he couldn't really bring himself to draw back from it. I don't think there was a lot of pressure, and there are times, especially when Andrew Cartmell's there, where I think he does fly off the handle, but there were things going on in his private life with his parents that explained some of that. It wasn't just the pressure of being the producer of Doctor Who, but the everyday pressures of life that we all have to deal with, family and finances and other things that sometimes can cloud your judgment when they really shouldn't. But John was as human as the next man.
Certainly one of John's strengths was his ability to garner publicity for the show. I was reading a couple of days ago the press contingent that followed them to Amsterdam while filming Arc of Infinity. John seems to have been strong in, or interested in, publicity for the show, and also merchandise and marketing the show, across the, especially in America. Was that typical of BBC producers at the time, or were they more, were the rest of them working at the BBC more interested in just producing television and not necessarily flying out to America seemingly every weekend?
Well, when it comes to publicity, getting column inches in the tabloids, John was very mindful of that. And I certainly think he paid more attention to it than the average BBC producer of the time. Don't forget the BBC did have a press office, and it was the press officer's job to actually go out and sell the stories to the papers and do all that. And John got a bit more involved than some of his contemporaries, I think, ever did. As you say, going to Amsterdam and bringing along reporters and photographers from 4 or 5 different Fleet Street newspapers. It was a bit of a coup, but it kind of detracted from what John should be doing as his day job, I think, which is to actually make the program and to set up photo opportunities. He did think long and hard about these. When he went to Amsterdam for Arc of Infinity, he made sure they packed Sarah Sutton's snake dance costume so that they could have that photo call with Tegan and Nyssa in a snake dance outfit and Peter Davison all on the tandem. When he did the press photo call for, I think it was Cursor Fenric, he didn't want the press to photo Sylvester in his new brown jacket, so they packed the season 25 cream one, and all of the press photos, or a lot of them, Sylvester's got his cream jacket on. So he did think about things like that very carefully. In terms of the conventions, I think that's a different, separate conversation, really. They only really started up just as John took over as producer in America. There had been a few DWAS events in the UK since the late 70s, and they were becoming far more prevalent in the early 80s, and John started attending those. But He flew out to Panopticon West in, I think it was 1981. And I think that opened his eyes to the potential of the American convention and the American audience. There wasn't an audience that was like Star Wars or Star Trek in America, but PBS had done a good job of getting Doctor Who on air in a regular time slot in America. And then there was a small, by American standards, interest in the series, but that translates into many, many thousands of fans. And so the American conventions could almost from the outset be run on a commercial footing, which the British events never could do in the UK, and has certainly struggled, up until this day.
Yeah, that's right. One thing that sort of struck me when I was reading the book was, in some ways, JNT was ahead of the curve in some ways, where when he got hold of the program, he was thinking about spin-off shows. He was trying to obtain, co-production deals for filming in Australia and America. Now we sort of take for granted, don't we, really? And obviously the modern series. But back then, he obviously had that eye on, trying to get programs' profile more visible than what it used to be, and potentially getting some overseas jaunts in could lift it.
Well, I mean, John's the only classic series producer who ever got a Doctor Who spin-off into production in K9 and Company. And when I was doing the book, it did how K9 and Company was made. Well, okay, it wasn't the greatest of scripts, but it was a very competent production, and Elizabeth Sladen's marvelous in it, as she always was. And it did fantastic ratings. I think it got bigger ratings than season 18 had got, and I think it might have got bigger ratings than the opening installments of season 19. So why it was never commissioned is a mystery. I never really got to the bottom of why it stalled. And obviously John had aspirations for it beyond the single 50-minute pilot. If anything, it probably got a bit bogged down in a change of controllers, maybe not controllers, but head of departments, and it kind of lost a bit of impetus. When it comes to the overseas filming, I think John could see two benefits. One, it made the program look a bit different for 4 weeks or 6 weeks, wherever the story was set. City of Death, he was the person that really made that work for Graham Williams, and that was a fantastic production for the time and the budget that went into it. But he was also looking for co-production money to boost his coffers. And that's why he was looking to Australia for maybe a couple of stories in the early 80s, and why he was always looking to get a co-production deal with BBC Enterprises to do a story in America, which never nearly happened with the two Doctors, but fell apart. So I think he was coming at it from a number of angles, and it could perhaps look like he was just trying to do something that would make the program stand out a little bit more. But I think he had the best of intentions.
We also need to talk about JNT's interest in merchandising. Pretty evident very early on that he's, obviously chasing the deal, as it were, whether it's getting himself a book deal very early on or ramping up the show's merchandising as well. Was his interest in this sort of driven by trying to expand the popularity of the show to get greater viewing figures, or what was the sort of rationale for him?
Well, I think he saw merchandising. It was free advertising. If there were Doctor Who books in W.H. Smith's, it made people aware of Doctor Who and more likely to sit down and watch Doctor Who. If there was a very good Doctor Who exhibition in Blackpool or Longleat that presented the props and costumes in a very effective and dramatic way, as they often did, the more people that would see those exhibitions, they're more likely to tune into the next series of Doctor Who. The better quality that Doctor Who Weekly and Doctor Who Monthly were, again, it was just a shop window for the program. Maybe, I'm only conjecturing here, if that's a word, if the commercial spin-offs were doing well, the target books were selling, if Doctor Who Weekly's sales figures were going up, that was more money coming back into BBC Enterprises as a result of Doctor Who, and that could strengthen John's hand in tapping up BBC Enterprises for additional co-production money. You want some monsters to show in your exhibitions? We'll build you some nice monsters, but can we have some money for the costumes, please? That sort of conversation,
In terms of these extracurricular activities, specifically his interest in the American market, you point out in your book that that excited some negative feelings from British fandom. That aside, did John's trips to the US and his interest in merchandising, so sort of things outside his immediate purview and the reason that he was producer, did all those extra things tend to distract him from the main job? Did it impact on his ability to do his job? I mean, he was flying out on a Friday and coming back on a Sunday. Have you seen any evidence of any negative impacts on the production itself?
There are two ways of looking at that. I mean, yes, those extracurricular activities did impact on the productions. Certainly when Revelation of the Daleks was in production, he was also hawking his pantomime that had Colin and Nicola appearing twice daily matinees and 3 times at weekends. So that impacted on their availability for rehearsals. It impacted on where the location filming for the exteriors of Necros, they had to be conducted close to where the theatre was that they were appearing in. There was an instance where I think he took Peter Davison to a convention, and just after Kinder, I can't remember off the top of my head if it was just after a studio recording or just after a rehearsal, but he was flying close to the wind in terms of his time management. As you say, going to a convention on a Friday, coming back jet-lagged Monday morning and straight into work. And I know the perception of people like Eric Saywood is that they thought it was affecting John's ability to produce to his best abilities. Whether it was or whether it wasn't, it was foisting discontent, shall we say.
Did his activities outside the production office earn him any commentary from his people he reported to, or did he sort of manage to fly under the radar in that regard?
I think he tried his best to fly under the radar, and when it was brought up, he would be, well, I'm just promoting the series and that. I think where it did fall into areas of possible conflict was when he was being paid to attend American conventions. I do touch on that a little bit, but certainly I think that might have crossed the line had it been known at the time, shall we say.
And it's interesting that JNT, especially in the early to mid-80s, saw himself equally as important as a lead actor in the role, by attending, obviously, the conventions in the US and to a smaller extent the UK. In your book, he's proposing to Enterprises the first iteration of the Hartnell years, where he's proposing himself to present that production, setting himself into photo opportunities, whether it's an overseas jaunt or even in the Five Doctors ones, and even, casting and everything like that. Do you think fandom's early adulation of him contributed to this attitude, or do you think it was just another way for him to try and promote the program and he saw himself as the best vessel to do it?
John was a frustrated showman from the very start. I mean, if you've ever seen Chris Chapman's very excellent biography of John on, I forget which Blu Ray it was now, was it the
season 26? Season
26, they all blur into one for me, but that's a magnificent oversight of John's personality and character, and demonstrates, I think, in the early days how much of a showman John was. So I think it did that did appeal to that part of his personality, that he could get up on stage and tell some shaggy dog stories, or be totally serious and have the attention and the interest of an audience. And I think he liked that. I mean, we all do when people like what we're doing. I don't know that. I mean, obviously, he saw himself as somebody that was capable of fronting something like a video project, like he was proposing for the early Hartnell years with him as the host. And he'd certainly, done a lot of stuff in America on stage at the conventions there. Not so much in the UK, to be honest. He's far more of a performer for the American fans. So I think that was just an aspect of John's personality that the conventions brought to the fore. I don't think he necessarily saw himself as a star. And, we've all seen, I do say a lot, don't I? We've all seen the photos of John stood between a couple of co-stars, pointing at them with his fingers, and John just liking a little memento to put on the office wall. While we're here, while you got your camera, let's have one with me and the new Doctor, or me and the new companion, or something I can use just for my own fun.
And there's still plenty of 40 and 50-year-old Doctor Who fans, when they get together and they're having photo opportunities, have the fingers pointing at each other as a slight homage. When I was reading the book, it did debunk for me a number of myths. The vampire mutation that Terrence Dicks wrote for season 15. I was under the impression all 4 episodes are there and sitting on the shelf and ready to go. It sounded like there's only 1 episode there that was actually available, and they commissioned Terrence to do the rest. When you were going through the paperwork for this book, what information that you uncovered while trawling through it was new to you?
At the time, there were lots of things that I thought, did I know this? Do I know this? Is this new? I don't know about you chaps, but it's very difficult sometimes to know when you find something new, or if you're just finding something that you did know but had forgotten. Or maybe it's just me getting old. But I was forever finding little bits of interesting trivia, which I thought, I never knew this before. The whole problem that John had with the Children in Need production team in 1980, where they completely cocked things up for Tom Baker and for Lalla Ward and for Peter Davison, and John had a real problem there. Little bits of trivia of how he got the Generation game interested in doing some Doctor Who related features, how he nearly got the 5th Doctor, Nyssa and Tegan, appearing in character in addition of It's a Knockout.
Yes.
Guys wouldn't know what It's a Knockout is, but it was a very big thing in the 80s and 70s in the UK. Lots of little things like that were always cropping up, going back to them and rereading them. And it began to be very difficult to know where I first came across this information. So I'm quite gratified to hear that you were finding things that you thought you never knew before in the book, because I hope there will be a lot of things that a lot of people didn't know before in the book.
Well, certainly the book is a compendium of information that I think a lot of classic series fans will enjoy having in one spot, and I hope it also attracts the interest of news fans who've come to the show via the new series, because it is a really fascinating historical window on how television was produced 30 or 40 years ago. And on a lighter note, one thing that I didn't really appreciate was John's love of the BBC bar after studio recordings. Like I began to underline my printed out copy of your book every time there was a mention of the BBC bar, and I very quickly ran out of ink.
That's very simply because John's always putting an expense claim through for hospitality. Now, it could be that it was just a convention. I think a lot of them do seem to appear on the first night of a studio recording, and I think it was just a question of, right, with 10 o'clock, drinks on me, I'll get the first round in. When he was meeting up with writers, they'd probably either initially go and meet in the production office or something, but then they'd go and have a more of a little social discussion somewhere, probably with the script editor in tow as well. It's hard to know for certain who was there, but John was definitely, right, I met this person and we had a drink somewhere.
Richard, previous production teams, there was generally a consistent tone to their particular eras. So if you look at Hinchcliffe and Holmes, they're 3 years together. They seem to work together in harness, in lockstep, and that era of the show has a definite feel from beginning to end. I've often thought that John Nathan Turner's time in the show, there's different sub-eras within the larger era, and that is down to his script editors. Bidmead's time in the show has a particular tone, Eric Saywood's time has a particular tone, and Cartmell's time has a particular tone. Can you tell us a little bit about John's working relationship with Bidmead and Saywood and Cartmell in terms of, I suppose, the production process of the show and how it all came together?
Just to go back a little bit, I think under Graham Williams, he also had 3 script editors in just 3 years, if you recall.
Yes.
And there's not much you can say between them, although I do think season 17 with Douglas Adams is a slightly more unique season than the other 2 of Graham's. But certainly, yes. For me, there isn't a JNT era. There is the JNT Bidmead era, the JNT Sayward era, and the JNT Cartmel era, and they're all very, very different in how they present themselves, how the show was produced, how the scripts were written. I think with Chris Bidmead, they had a very healthy respect for each other. They were both learning the jobs from day one. And I think there was a healthy respect, but I think Chris became very frustrated very quickly, in that it very quickly became apparent to him that he was possibly the most important person on the programme, but his salary didn't perhaps reflect that. The script editors are what the showrunners of today are now called. Stephen Moffat and Russell T Davies. They were the people driving the creative side of the programme forward, whereas producers generally were there to make sure that the studios were booked, the budgets were met, the directors were brought on board, and that the whole show went along. And I think Chris felt undervalued, not necessarily by John, but by the BBC as a whole, and decided that he would chance his arm a little bit and ask for his contribution to be more recognised financially than it was. And they said thanks, but no thanks. And so he decided to just bow out and do other things, which is fair enough. I mean, everybody has a perceived value to their work, and if it's not met, then they go and do something else. Eric came in on the strength of his script for The Visitation, which I think is a very solid workman-like first attempt at writing Doctor Who. I think that would have made people sit up and get noticed, and he very quickly followed that up with Shock, which was one of the highlights of Davison's era, I think. And I think he was energized by the challenge of being the script editor on Doctor Who, although I think he very quickly found it a very tiring process in that by then John was of the opinion that the old school writers that he'd used early on, like Terence Dix and David Fisher, were not to be asked back, and getting people like Robert Holmes involved again in Doctor Who was a complete no-no, and until sometime later when they were thinking about the 20th anniversary. And a lot of the writers that John had brought in with Chris Bidmead, like Johnny Byrne, I don't think Eric really got on well with, or Stephen Gallagher. So he had to cast about and try and find new people to write for the series, and got frustrated that not many writers that wanted to work on Doctor Who were of the caliber he felt were adequate to work on Doctor Who. And I think he got very, very frustrated very, very quickly. And when Davison left, his antipathy towards Colin Baker as the Sixth Doctor, I think, affected his judgment in how he constructed and commissioned scripts. I've had to sit through season 22 a number of times quite recently, and it seems to me that there's something very strange going on in that season, in the way the stories, I mean, they had to restructure the whole thing anyway for the 45-minute episodes, which didn't help. But the approach to the series seemed to change then. So I wouldn't even say Eric Sayward's time as script editor is a single consistent entity. I think there's the Davison Sayward, and then there's the Colin Baker Sayward, and the Colin Baker Sayward has all sorts of problems, which were exacerbated by the cancellation, the postponement, and the general nightmare of the production of season 23, which just lurched from crisis to crisis to crisis. And I think he also was very badly affected by Robert Holmes's death. I think he felt a large degree of personal responsibility, none of which was at all justified. He was not responsible for Robert's illness, but he felt he was, and he felt responsible to a degree to Robert dying. And he was in a toxic working environment at that point, and the whole thing just fell apart. And the series unquestionably suffered because of it. And I don't think John particularly handled it as well as he could, but he was trying to make the best of it with all of the problems that were being thrust upon him. And Sayward walking out was just, John got on with it. You can say what you like about the results, but there were 6 months when Doctor Who was just one man, John Nathan Turner. Andrew Cartmel didn't come on board until late 86. So for most of 1986, it was just John in the production office with his production secretaries, trying to make the best of a job he by that time really wanted to be done with, get out of. He desperately wanted to walk away from Doctor Who at the end of season 23, thought he was done, thought he was out the door, and was dragged back to it. So Andrew Cartmel then comes in, and I think by that point, John is very disenchanted with Doctor Who and doesn't really stick his oar into the scripting process as much as he had done with Chris and with Eric. And Andrew then has more of a free hand, has a pool of young writers who he encourages, and definitely changes the tone of Doctor Who. And that's how it went for the next 3 years. And I think you could see that there were signs of an improvement.
Now you've touched on the cancellation. You said at the start of the interview that Doctor Who was held in high regard. I think you mentioned at the time that John Nathan Turner took over. I mean, it was doing well in the ratings. I think the people at the top were quite happy with it being in the schedule. Over the 4, 5, 6 years up until the temporary cancellation, we'll call it. From looking at the paperwork and your own experience in other other stuff that you've done in terms of your research, just for the audience, where was the show immediately prior to the cancellation being announced?
I think John was more or less making the show on autopilot, and he was being a bit diluted in his day-to-day running of the program simply by going to so many American conventions in 1984 when the first Colin Baker season was in production. And that season also coincided with Jonathan Powell coming in as the head of department there at the BBC. And it's very clear that Jonathan Powell had no time for Doctor Who. He had no time for John, and really actively disliked the series. And Michael Grade came in as the big boss of BBC One some months after that. And while Michael wasn't anti-Doctor Who, I don't think, and I have the benefit of seeing something you haven't in that I've seen his interview for the season 22 Blu Ray box set. Michael put up no resistance to the idea of ditching Doctor Who from the BBC schedules. I mean, Michael was very much a TV pragmatist, and he thought the money could be better spent elsewhere. And a program that had had a 22-year run at that point had had a very good innings. I don't think he was at all prepared for the publicity and the furore that the cancellation generated. Neither was Jonathan Powell, but they both could see what other controllers and other head of departments had perhaps not, or been blind to, or were happy just to wave away, in that Doctor Who was treading water. It was being made the same as it had been certainly since the early 70s. The production process had evolved a little beyond the 60s, but it hadn't evolved dramatically. And a lot of the stories that year, as I say, they were struggling with the 45-minute format. The focus of a lot of the scripting was very odd, I thought. The focus wasn't really the Doctor. The Doctor wasn't written too sympathetically. John had made a horrendous schoolboy error in insisting on Colin Baker's costume being as awful and as gaudy as it was. And it just took away any possibility of the character being taken seriously. You tune into an episode of Doctor Who in Tom Baker's era, and you can ignore the Daleks or the Mandrels. You can see it's a serious piece of drama, or trying to be. Whereas it's just not like that in Colin's seasons, unfortunately. And the costume has to take a lot of the responsibility, but the scripts weren't helping.
No, and it was very insular looking, wasn't it, at the time? Like, it just seemed to be pandering to the fans, lots of continuity, and especially like Attack of the Cybermen, where you sort of had to know some of the back history of some stories to sort of get across, what the intent of it was.
That was, I think Doctor Who can be as guilty of that today. I mean, I sat through Flux and I hadn't got a clue what I've watched.
We're still trying to work it out ourselves, mate.
And yes. I think, should I have been making notes during Jodie's first story a few years ago? I mean, it just lost me. So yeah, But don't forget, in Tom Baker's first season, they had Daleks, they had Sontarans, they had Cybermen. It wasn't insular then. They just used the old monsters in a new and interesting and captivating way. And I don't think you can say the same for season 22.
I was going to ask Richard, and I suppose it's a question that you can't really answer at this distance, but had JNT had the same scripting background as some of his predecessors, I mean, do you think that some of these issues, the relationship issues he had with Saywood, some of the issues with, the scripting of the show and the approach of the show, especially during the Colin Baker era, could have been overcome?
If John had come through a different route to get to where he was in the BBC, he wouldn't have been a production unit manager. He might have been a script editor. He might have taken a whole different direction, and it would have maybe formed him into a different person. So I don't know that you could bolt on that aspect to John and try and extrapolate something. John was what John was. And you mentioned mentioned with one of your earlier answers that in that period, after Colin Baker had effectively been sacked and Eric Saywood had walked out the door in a fury, that John was effectively, it was a one-man show for much of 1986, I believe you said. How did he manage to cope with putting it out a new season, knowing that the show was effectively, frowned upon by the people who are in charge? How did he manage to cope and bring something to the screen, regardless of what you think of the quality or anyone thinks of the quality? Just by putting his head down, I think. Eric walked out just as I think Mind Warp was going into the studio. Mysterious Planet was done and dusted. Mind Warp was just going into production. I think the Vervoid scripts had just arrived from Pip and Jane, although Eric, didn't really want them to be commissioned. But they'd done something that Chris Midmead and so many other writers hadn't done, and that was to fill that slot in the season. They'd been trying to get some workable scripts for the episodes 9 through to 12 for months and months, and so many people had let them down. So I think John he knew enough about how Doctor Who was made, how the BBC worked. He could just get on with it. It might not be great, but he had to have something to show at 5:15 on a Saturday tea time. So the only thing you can say is that when Eric withdrew his script for Trial 14, it was solely down to John that Pip and Jane came in and wrote the concluding part of Trial of a Time Lord. What he perhaps should have done is just abandon Robert Holmes's script for part 13 and say to Pip and Jane, right, you've got a clean slate, 2 episodes. We've already decided on the locations, I'm afraid, so we're stuck committed to filming up in Stoke at the Potteries in a couple of weeks' time. But apart from that, do what you like, just let's wrap this story up. He should have perhaps done that, but instead he did it the way he did it. And it might not have worked particularly well, but it worked.
When JNT took over the program, what sort of struck me was that I think in his mind, he probably only wanted to stay on it for a year or 2 at least. In the background, he was pitching different ideas. I mean, there was a couple that sort of struck out for me was Australia's own Jeannie Little proposing having a chat show with her. But the one that really surprised me was that JNT and Peter Greenway's idea of a modern retelling of Sherlock Holmes. Was this constant pitching of ideas for his next projects a normal procedure or a normal thing for BBC producers to do? Or is it only that JNT said, I'm just going to do this for a couple of years and then I want to move on to something else?
I think it was very normal for producers to pitch new ideas. Some producers were very successful at pitching new ideas. Robert Banks Stewart, whenever he had an idea, people at the BBC would usually sit up and take notice. And we had Shoestring and we had Bergerac because of that. And I think John, it might not have been explicitly part of his job description, but saw it as something he was expected to do, is come up with new ideas to throw at his head of department in the hope that somebody would go, oh yeah, let's have a discussion about that. But I think the BBC was changing a little bit at the time, and where you could do a deal with a breakdown sketched on the back of a fag packet in the 70s, the BBC was moving a bit more towards a structured commissioning process in the 80s. Maybe John could have got a few of those ideas to fly, but a lot of his ideas were not that great, I don't think. And I think you needed the wow factor in any pitch that you were doing. If you've got somebody's ear, like the controller of BBC One, who you're meeting on a regular basis to discuss the scripts of your current project, you really got to up your game to try and get them interested in commissioning, something else from you, in the hope that they'll go, yeah, fine, and you can take over this new program that you've developed, and we'll get Bob Smith in to do Doctor Who next year. John was never able to do that. I don't know this, but I think perhaps John just was not popular amongst his peers at the BBC for whatever reason.
The pictures that he put together, the documentation, was that included in the artifacts that you have at all, or it was just basically, as you said, written on the back of a fact packet somewhere? Was it sort of more detailed briefs kicking around?
Well, there's a whole host of documentation I drew from the book, a lot of which came from John's archive, which was passed to us by Stephen Cranford. But there's a lot of documentation in the BBC's written archive, a lot of which I've had access to over the years when I was doing the production subtitles for the DVDs. And obviously we've got the curated PDFs that Richard Bignell puts together for the Blu Ray releases. So I was able to skim through all of the documents that Richard had found for seasons 18, 19, 24 and 26. So that helped fill some gaps. There's paperwork from other sources as well. So it wasn't 100% all from John's own archive.
Yeah.
And I can't remember precisely where the sources were for each one, but there were sources. They were written down somewhere and usually dated. And if they were dated, I could include them.
When reading the book, when he's talking about Logopoulos, he was sounding out, having Jeannie Little, sounding out the dates. I'm convinced that she was being targeted almost for appearing as Auntie Vanessa in Logopoulos. Yes.
She was Australian, mate.
She was.
Yeah, I don't know anything about her. I have found a few clips of her on YouTube. Yes.
I mean, obviously, anyone who's interested in Jenny Little, they can find clips, as you say, on YouTube. There was a really nice documentary. I think, Mark, it's on Australian Story on the ABC,
right.
which is quite affecting. It looks at her last years and her decline. But she would have been definitely a bit of an eye opener for British viewers at the time.
I mean, I must be honest. What I don't know is how she came on John's radar in the first place. Obviously, their friendship predated his rise to producership on Doctor Who in 1979. They'd obviously known each other before then, and there's a lot of correspondence between the two of them. John would write to her in Australia and was very supportive of her career, and I've heard it said he was instrumental in getting her a spot on the Parkinson show over here. Might be wrong on that, which was kind of her big break into the UK, which perhaps her last break into the UK as well.
Looking through the documentation as you did, Richard, through expenses and receipts and letters and stuff like that, what sense, if any, did you get of John Nathan Turner from that paperwork? I mean, I suppose a lot of it is dry material, but what sense, if you can sort of think of any, did you get of him as the man himself?
I think he prided himself in what he saw as his professionalism. Whether he was as professional as he should have been is another question, but I think he knew what he needed to do and how he needed to do it. How to dot the I's and cross the T's. Everything in terms of production paperwork is quite meticulous in terms of booking studios and booking directors, and everything is quite meticulous in that respect. I don't really know how you can get a measure of anybody from reading their paperwork and their expense claims, to be honest. I think you need to fill the gaps in from other areas.
As you said before, Richard, John Nathan Turner was desperate to get out, to leave the show and do something else. By the time we get to sort of 1989, it's obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, it seems clear that the BBC was looking to euthanize the show effectively. But there was talk of contracting it out. But John Nathan Turner was effectively kept out of the loop of all those discussions. Is that correct?
It very much looks like it from what I can see. And when I did speak to John a few times about this when our paths did cross in the 90s, and I think he was very much not in the loop at all. It was a question of is the show coming back as a BBC production every year? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. 1989. No, it isn't. Thank you very much. We'll let you know. And obviously, at the end of the financial year, John was told he was going to be made redundant and given effectively 6 months' notice, I think it was. So he was literally twiddling his thumbs for most of 1990, sat in a very deserted and lonely production office, which must have been heartbreaking for him.
Absolutely demoralising, isn't it?
But in terms of what the BBC were planning for Doctor Who, I think it's very clear they knew it wasn't going to come back in 1990. They wanted a new series made by an outside production company for 1991, and were not adverse to perhaps getting Sylvester back or Sophie back, although they would have had to renegotiate those contracts. But it was completely to be in the hands of the new producers. That was probably going to be Verity Lambert, for Verity Lambert's production company. Whether she'd have had any hands-on involvement in the programme is unknowable. But the whole thing was scuppered by BBC Enterprises, basically welching on the deal. They thought they could, or they were under the impression they wouldn't have to bankroll as much of the series production as they were being asked to do. And they said no, and the whole deal collapsed. I don't think the BBC was saying, "Oh, we'll kill Doctor Who in 1989. We'll just tell everybody we'll bring it back." There might be a longer gap. I don't think that was a play for time or trying to deflect attention. I think there were serious or semi-serious efforts to try and get something into production in 1990. So a new series of as many as 20 episodes, although possibly it could have only been 14. I think they might have made 20 episodes and held 6 back for the 1991 season. But there was a desire, I think, for Doctor Who to come back after they'd set it up as an independent production. But because of the BBC Enterprises situation, the whole thing just fell apart. And then it was too late to bring it back in-house, at least for that financial year. And once you can't do it for 1990 or 1991, then you've just got out of the habit of making Doctor Who. And then all of a sudden, there's a guy in America who starts banding about the name of Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let them have it for a bit.
After having trawled through all that information, Richard, and putting the book together and sort of, imbibing that era, has your opinion or attitude of John Nathan Turner and his era changed as a result of all that work that you've done, or has it reinforced, your previous opinions? Tell us a little bit about that.
I wouldn't say it's changed. It's maybe evolved a little bit. I can remember having a conversation with John at the end of one of the Panopticon conventions in the early 90s, when we were both a wee bit tipsy, shall we say. And to the great amusement of the people I was sitting with, I tried to explain very patiently to John where he'd gone wrong.
Oh.
He took it rather well at the time. And I look back and cringe at my arrogance and presumptuousness at the time. I think what the putting the book together has taught me is that John was very passionate about Doctor Who and always thought he was doing the right thing. I don't think he listened to enough people at certain times where he could possibly have been persuaded to do something a little differently. He was a bit headstrong in that respect. That's not necessarily a bad thing either, if you're convinced that you know what you're doing and that is the right thing to do. And it's really down to personal perception. I think there's a lot of criticism that's come John's way over the years for what he did as a producer, and I think a lot of it is justified. But nobody ever sets out to make a bad piece of television or a bad program. Certainly since I started making documentaries and programs myself, some of which I'm very, very proud of, and others I look at and think, Christ, you could have done that better. Nobody ever sets out to do something deliberately bad, but it's just an act of compromise every step of the way in production. And those compromises sometimes scupper your best intentions. And I think if John had been a bit more stronger in some areas, he wouldn't have made the compromises that he did. But he was always trying to do the best for Doctor Who, I think.
And finally, then, before we move on to a couple of other topics, what do you hope readers will get out of reading this book? I mean, for me, it, again, as I said before, it's a really fascinating look back at how television was made of our, ostensibly our favourite show back in the 80s. But what do you hope readers get out of it, Richard?
Well, precisely that. I think anybody with an interest in how Doctor Who was made in the 80s would find the book hopefully an interesting read, an insightful read, might have some new information in there. But I also think, and it's something I'd never really done before, we're all very familiar with the wonderful archive articles that Andrew Pixley did for Doctor Who magazine, for example, where it takes a story and sets out from, the first pitch of the script to the last edit in the edit suite, how that story is made. But seeing how a whole season is put together and how the stories overlap and how problems or issues with a story has a knock-on effect throughout the season, and then seeing how the seasons are all put together over the decade, paints a picture which I don't think I'd ever appreciated before, in the complexity of the production of Doctor Who and what John had to contend with and what he did as part of his day-to-day management of the series. And that contextualization hopefully is something that's quite unique, hopefully.
Well, I think it is. I mean, as you were saying, I mean, the Andrew Pixley archives were splendid in terms of the depths that they go to, but they were issue to issue. As you've said, and what you've done is you've put that all together in one, between two covers. And I think that, as you say, that contextualization will bring to a lot of people the size of the task that John Nathan Turner had in, putting out a season of television year after year after year. And for bringing that all together and doing it in a entertaining and comprehensible manner, I can only take my hat off to you and congratulate you for it.
Absolutely.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Hope other people do too.
Richard, obviously this book is not the only thing that you've been involved with Doctor Who. I mean, in the past, you've, as I mentioned at the start, you've written a biography, effectively, of Robert Holmes. How was writing that biography different or similar to putting this book together?
That was quite an interesting project, in that I'd always been a great fan of Robert's work, and I'd done a documentary on the Two Doctors DVD about Robert's Doctor Who stories, and at the time had met up with his daughter and gone down to his cottage and looked through his study and gone through his scripts, and thought that was just so evocative of his life. And I was trying to get in touch with her again about 10 years later, I can't remember for what now, and found out that she'd died.
Oh, no.
And Robert's son had died, Robert's wife had died. And it suddenly occurred to me that there were a lot of people that were no longer around that knew who Robert Holmes was as a person. And I thought it'd be, if we don't do it now and interview the people that we can and get the stories about Robert's life, the opportunity would be gone. So I decided I'd better do it. And that was a book. I had no idea of what the story was until I wrote it. Whereas Wiped, I knew exactly what was going to be on page one and what was going to be on the final page and what was going to be on every page in between. I went into the Robert Holmes biography quite blind. It was a project of discovery, finding the paperwork, putting the pieces together, working out what he was doing and when and how and what the problems were. And that was a very enjoyable project because of it. Not that Wiped wasn't, but it was a different type of project. But having done that, I remember telling myself, right, you're never going to write another book again after that.
How did that work out for you?
Badly.
Well, certainly Robert Holmes: A Life in Words is still available for purchase. So I obviously encourage everyone to go out. Robert Holmes is one of the key writers of this of the classics series, and I think it provided inspiration for a couple of the showrunners who've worked on the new series. So definitely go out and search for that one. Now, Richard, now that we've got you on the podcast, my and Mark's love of missing episodes. You're our man for this. You've obviously wiped. I managed to purchase both editions of that, so you can thank me later for that.
Or as we call it, the Bible, Rob.
With regards to missing episodes and your journey through investigating and writing about that, I remember you wrote a series of articles for DWM, I think in the 90s, which I believe were the eventual catalyst for Wiped. How has your perspective for the hunt of missing episodes changed since, say, the 1980s? And how do you believe that fandom's engagement with the issue has similarly changed?
I've always been obviously interested in the whole subject of missing episodes and trying to work out why they were missing in the first place, because that was the big. It made no sense to me why you'd have episodes 1, 2, and 3 of the 10th Planet and not episode 4. How you could get episode 4 of the Demons in color but not the rest. I couldn't see the rhyme or reason, and I wanted to make sense of something which didn't seem to have any sense to it. So the whole investigation of why episodes were missing and how episodes had been recovered and found, and the stories behind all of those recoveries were something that always greatly fascinated me. And grandiosely, I thought I was the person best placed to tell those stories and put it all together in a book. My enthusiasm for the subject has been diminished in recent years, I have to say, by the aftermath of the whole Omni rumor rubbish that went on in 2012, 2013. I've come away from the whole experience quite. I've just had enough of it, really.
Fair enough.
I don't think it did anybody much credit.
No.
And a lot of the discussion became very toxic, and for a variety of reasons, things couldn't be said at the time, which might have rode back on some of the expectations. But it is what it is.
The majority of previous returns have come from overseas archives. Do you think that we may have reached an endpoint in those types of returns, and really realistically, assuming there's anything out there, it really would be from film collectors themselves?
I think we'll never know when the last missing episode has been recovered. There could always be 97 missing episodes. There could be 87. There could be 77. There could be 7. Who knows? That's kind of the joy of it, and also the curse of it, because you're always looking over the hill and over the horizon to see what could be coming. I think realistically, as the years go by, the chances of material being discovered reduces exponentially. What we do know is that a lot of stuff went walkies out of the BBC in the late 70s. People rescued films from skips. Films sometimes didn't even make the skips. And we know from the returns that came back from private collectors in the 80s that there was material that was out there, and we might not have found the last of it. Paul Venezis is a very good friend of mine. We still meet up every so often for a beer, and I know he's said on record that he thinks he knows where 2 episodes are, but he also hasn't seen them. And Paul has always said, I don't believe it until I've seen it. And until he opens those cans on those shelves, we won't know for certain. So you never know. I mean, there could be a couple more out there. There could be a dozen more. There could be who knows what out there. But while they're out there, they're out there. And if they never come back, we'll never know, and we'll be none the wiser.
Exactly. It's not going to change anything, is it, really? I mean,
no. Even if we did know for certain, and I can categorically say I know of nothing that isn't on the shelves of the BBC. I don't know what Paul thinks is on some collector's shelves. I don't know if anyone else, thinks they know where missing episodes are. If they do, I certainly don't. So, and the pool is becoming ever more smaller of people to try and recover this stuff from. So who knows?
What a cheery way to end that particular discussion.
I was hoping you'd say, stay tuned. Lift it up a bit.
So, Richard, you've been project manager on the Blu-ray releases over the last year or two. Can you just give us a little bit of a flavour of what you do? What does a project manager do? And some of the stuff that you've worked on that you've been particularly proudest of?
Well, I was made project manager when season 23 was just being pulled together. So that was the first box set that I was involved with. And what my role is basically overseeing the delivery from Peter Crocker and Mark Ayres of the restored episodes, and from the various producers, the new, what we call VAM, value added material. It's a horrible word, but that's what it's called, the new VAM that Russell Minton commissions. Some of that he makes himself, like behind the sofas. Some of that he commissions out to people like Chris Chapman and Paul Venisis and Steve Broster. For new documentaries, he gets Ed Stradling to pull together the trails and continuities, the new photo galleries that get commissioned, and I oversee the delivery of all those items and liaising with the facilities housings to make sure that they pass what we call the QC, the quality control, that there are no bad edits, or that basically that they're okay technically to go out on the Blu-rays. And I mean, editorially, it's all down to Russell, but occasionally I'll flag something up and say, are you aware of this? But it's Russell's baby, basically, and he's ably assisted by Pete McTighe. And Pete's put together really the program for the Blu-rays, where he's decided where all of the old DVD VAM is now going to be rehoused. As you're probably aware, there are things that, say, came out on the Trial of a Time Lord DVD box set that aren't on the season 23 Blu-ray release, but the objective is to put everything out that was on DVD onto a Blu-ray somewhere if we can. There are a couple of issues with rights on a few things, but the majority of the old VAM will appear at some point on one of the box sets. So I'm the person that overviews the project. Russell tells me what's going on each disc. If it's old DVD VAM, I arrange to get that out of the BBC Studios archive and redigitized for the Blu-ray. The new VAM that comes in, make sure that hits its delivery deadlines, and that it's passes the QC process. And the same for the restored episodes from Peter and Mark. Like the production of Doctor Who in the 80s, the projects do tend to overlap. So it's very seldom that you're clear of one project and are waiting for the next one. There's a bit of a production line on the range. So that's what I can say about the future. The production line is still producing.
Keep feeding the machine, mate. And in terms of season 22, which has been announced as the next Blu-ray set, could you give us any sort of subtle hints or anything about what's on there or what we can look forward to?
The season 22 Blu-ray set, as you say, it's coming out shortly. Seen all of the items that are going to be on there, and there's some fantastic new programs and documentaries that have been put together. Like all of the box sets that I've been involved in, it's as comprehensive as we could possibly make it. Probably my least favorite season of Doctor Who is season 24, but when that box set came out, the amount of material that we got on there, I think was I thought it was fantastic.
Very, very comprehensive, and especially the new documentaries on there were brilliant. And even the studio footage of and I'll use it in air quotes here, regeneration of Sylvester McCoy is very interesting.
And there's plenty of that people won't have seen before. On the season 22 set, there are 3 new In Conversations that Paul Venice has done, one with Nicola Bryant, one with Colin Baker, and one with Michael Grade. And personally for me, I found the Michael Grade one to be far more entertaining and enlightening than I thought would be possible. It does bring a slightly new perspective on the events of 1985 and what was going on at the time. So I think that'll be a bit of an eye-opener for people. Like all of the box sets, it's packed full of goodies, and I don't think people will be disappointed. If you're not a fan of season 22, this probably won't make you a fan of season 22. But like season 24, I think it does help contextualize it. I certainly came out of season 24 with a different opinion of most of the stories than I had going into it, and the same possibly could be said for season 22. My opinion of season 14 hasn't changed. I think you'll find, and I've always loved season 17. I mean, that was a joy to work on that series. I think people will be quite impressed with season 22. I hope they will.
Just to bring it back full circle to the reason for the interview, I'm sure JNT would be surprised and delighted.
Yes.
Thank you very much. That such love and attention has been lavished on his particular era of the show. So, Richard, look, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. The John Nathan Turner Production Diary, 1979 to 1990, is currently available for pre-order at the Telos Publishing website. That's telos.co.uk, or you just Google Telos Publishing and you'll find it. £19.99 of your money. I'm not quite sure what that'll be of our money, but it's been published on the 1st of May, the website says, in 2022. So, as Mark said before, I think if you can pre-order this book directly from the publisher, it puts more money into their pockets, it puts more money into the hardworking writers' pockets, and that ensures that more of these books, more of these really in-depth, fascinating examinations of particular eras, there's more of that sort of thing is made possible. So, Richard, thank you very much for being on the podcast, and we look forward to the book coming out and it to being a great success.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all your questions. If I can just make one quick point, the 1st of May 2022 is very sadly the 20th anniversary of John's death. I think that was deliberately chosen by the publishers as the date to release the book. John was somebody I got to know very briefly in the 90s, and I hope it does him justice.
It definitely will. Thanks very much, Richard, and hopefully speak to you again very, very shortly.
Thank you.
You've just listened to another episode of 42 to Doomsday, the podcast that loves talking about Doctor Who. We'd love to hear from our listeners. Please drop us a line at 42todoomsday@gmail.com. We can be reached at facebook.com/42todoomsday. If brevity is your game, we can be found on Twitter at 42todoomsday. Please check out our blog, 42todoomsday.wordpress.com, where Mark and I occasionally have something interesting to say. Aside from iTunes, you can listen to us via Stitcher and Player FM. If you enjoyed listening to us, leave a review on iTunes. As always, thank you for listening. Have a great week. We'll speak with you again soon.